Welcome to Waiting on the Trade, a comics book club for people who can't keep up with monthly comics. I'm Matt Ledger.
I'm Patrick Fitzgerald Fleck.
And I'm Jonathan Gurney.
This month, we're talking about the fourth and final volume of Kieron Gillen, Stephanie Hans & Co.'s Die. Now, in case you need a refresher, Die is the story of 5 friends who return to a fantasy world they escaped in their youth, in their attempt to escape that world again. The 3 of us discussed Volume 1 of this story together 2.5 years ago, which is kind of wild to think about. A lot has changed since then, but at the same time, Die hasn't changed that much. It's still good. It's still really good. Yeah, I think we should just get into it, guys. I feel like this is going to end up being a long episode, even though we've got the discussion question format to kind of theoretically keep us more focused. I think we should just...
Yeah.
But before we get into it, do you want to say, Jono, welcome back to the podcast. It has been a little bit because we've had some additional guests filling out our schedule, so it's lovely to have you back on.
Oh, it's always a pleasure to be invited.
So typically, I still ask at the top of the show, like, hey, why did you bring this book to us? But I, push this book upon you because I've been so excited to read it. So the last volume of Die came out in November of 2021, I believe. I think that's right. So, it came out, roughly around Thanksgiving. I didn't buy it because I knew if I bought it, I would read it immediately. And I wanted to save it for the 3 of us to discuss because we had, such a good discussion of the first volume of Die. And I thought it would be really intriguing to be able to do the first volume and the last volume of a series on the podcast because that's not a thing we've been able, it's not a thing we've done yet. Achievement unlocked with this episode that we've, hit the front and the back of a series, which is really cool to me. So... Jono, how do you feel that I have shoved this responsibility upon you?
Look, I think the last comic book that I bought you guys for Waiting on the Trade was the Hardy Boys, and so I have no regrets about having other recommendations made for comic books, especially Die, because as you said, that was the only reason that I read the first volume was because of the podcast, and to have the encouragement and the impetus to finish the series was a pleasure.
Yeah, and I did think specifically when we read the first volume that it was a very you book, because Pat and myself, you're an RPG guy a little bit, a games guy a little bit. So to be able to come back into it for the end of it, I figured you would still be interested. I hope that was true. I hope it held your attention and you enjoyed it.
I mean, and I think what we discovered was that I also had an obsession with stories about people being trapped in games.
Yes.
From childhood, reading those stories. So this was so far up my alley. Yep.
Yeah, I went back and I looked at the show notes for that episode. I didn't get a chance to actually re-listen to the podcast. Plus, I hate listening to my own voice, so the chances that I'm going to re-listen to an episode of the podcast are very slim, regardless. But I do remember, because I had put in the show notes one of the series that you really enjoyed as a kid, and I don't remember the name of it off the top of my head right now, but you will, I bet, where they're trapped in a game, I think.
I mean, look, there were a few. There was one specifically about Dungeons and Dragons, and the name escapes me right now, but it was very similar to Die in that, it starts out as this magical adventure, and I think within the first couple of chapters, one of the characters dies. They get murdered because they play a thief character and they think it's a good idea to try and steal from this noble. The noble has bodyguards, they get caught and they die, they are killed. And that's when I think the characters in the story are like, oh, actually, maybe being trapped in our fantasy world isn't what we thought it was. And then there was another series that I read that was about these kids that got trapped in a board game. That was more of a young adult kind of focus series, I think, and it was less an RPG, but the board game format was very much they had to escape the game to be able to get to be able to keep living. And there was this almost games master kind of character that was taunting them the whole way through and who basically wanted them to fail because then in some way that means that they would win and get to keep them or something along those lines.
Yeah, I'm looking at it now, and one of them was Guardians of the Flame.
Yes, I think that's the D&D style.
The first one? Okay. Yeah, that's what it looks like from this. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, like I said, that was always an interesting idea, I guess, is having your metaphorical fantasy cake and then finding out that it's actually got a razor blade inside. It's don't always want to get what you want.
Yeah, Dai sure did have some razor blades, huh?
Yes.
Dai sure an Ouroboros of razor blades.
I was tempted to make my question which revelation startled you the most while reading this series, because, yeah, there were a lot.
It definitely didn't pull punches.
No, definitely not. I mean, that's very Kieron Gillen-y. That like the work is not here is not essentially here to make you happy. Like by the end of it, you might have a bittersweet ending, and that's like the best you can hope for with a Kieron Gillen thing, as far as I'm aware, at least. And I think that's reading some of the interviews with him that I read in preparation for this. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, and I think like that was always something. There's two series that jump to mind, which might be slightly different from each other. But there's obviously Lord of the Rings by Tolkien, and then there's Animorphs by Catherine Applegate. And the reason that I use those two as an example is because obviously at the end of Lord of the Rings, spoilers if you haven't read the Lord of the Rings series, when the hobbits go home, it isn't to the idyllic home that they remember. Instead, the war that they have spent most of the books on the other side of the world fighting has actually come home as well. And Catherine Applegate, when she was asked about why she decided to make the last book of Animorphs quite so dark, she did use that as an example. She said, I want there to be a consequence to victory. So you might defeat the whatever the big bad evil guy is, but what does that actually cost you internally, or what does that cost the world? And actually get to see those consequences drives home. It makes the victory victorious, but it also there is a bittersweet notion to it, and I think that's something that I love about Die. I'd have to say that victory does not come without a cost.
Yeah, and this might be me like getting ahead of myself and potentially answering your question before we get into it, but like I think especially as I don't know if it's as I get older, I don't know if it's just the last couple years, I don't know what, but like victories are rarely clean at this point. So like I think this book especially is about people grappling with choices they made in their youth and trying to reconcile how to be better or complete or more like aware people. And so to just have like clean victories like that doesn't feel really in keeping with the themes of this book where the choices you make have consequences, and for you to like just somehow completely pay off those consequences and everything's like hunky dory by the end just wouldn't feel correct. And like the book actually does end semi happily, which is nice, but like semi happily I think was the best we could ever hope for.
Definitely. I think what one thing with Die is that a clean victory is often just a consequence deferred, and I think
Yep.
we see that very clearly from Volume One. We're not jumping ahead to Volume Four. I think from Volume One, when they come back to Die, when they return, and their initial horror isn't because. I mean, obviously, it's because they're back. Where they had so much trauma, but it's also because they don't want to see the consequences of what they saw. And I think there's a great line in Volume One that comes back to haunt them, but it's like we can survive anything except our past.
Yeah, the bit where they're trying to like just like do anything they can to avoid Angria, essentially. Like any like
Yes,
they'll walk across a war to avoid.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So, in I guess the vein of that discussion, like we've talked about Volume One before, we're going to talk about Volume Four in this one. We're going to talk about Volumes Two and Three. I'm sure at some point.
Hmm.
Spoiler mode is on. Like if you have not yet read Die Volume 4 and you're not ready to talk about it, like A, I don't know how you found this podcast episode in the first place. B, leave now. Because we're gonna go hard on it.
Yeah, go and read it and then come back and then listen to this episode, listen to the amazing analysis and stuff that we do.
Amazing.
Obviously we're gonna cover everything. There's not gonna be anything left. We're gonna pick the bones clean. But if we've
It's
missed
gonna be
something,
exhaustive. It's not gonna
let
be
Matt know.
exhaustive.
Yep.
This book's so much smarter than me, which is one of the reasons I love it. Like this book's just so much like this book has read so many other books than I have, you know?
Yeah, that gets into my question a little bit too.
Yeah.
I
Do
think
we want to
so.
just take
Yeah.
that one first, I think maybe?
Yeah, I guess mine is sort of different from the rest of yours. So yeah, I didn't know if we were gonna do mine first or yours, but sure. Starting this off, this volume I feel takes a much grander stance than the rest of the volumes, or at least it feels like Kieron Gillen really wanted to make an impact with this volume. So my question is, do you think the meta commentary of this volume helped or hurt the story?
I would like you to define meta commentary for me
Damn
as
you,
you're
Matthew. Why?
as you're approaching it in the question. I just want to make sure we're on the same page. This is not me. I'm not going to try to nitpick you. I just want to make sure we're talking about the same thing.
I think it's a fantastic question, but I also would value just so that we're very clear for the audience as well what we're going to be analyzing in terms of meta commentary.
The comic about RPGs, Pat. Give me the rules. What parameters am I operating within?
I'm not really like fully solid on what my definition of meta commentary is.
That's okay. We'll go by whatever your definition is. I think that's
It's
more than
like
okay.
pornography. You know it when you see it. No, it's
Almost spit out my wine, Pat.
it's when media is using its story to make a larger comment about the world that's outside the purview of its story. I feel is when it becomes when it sort
I'll
of
take that.
breaks the fourth wall and starts to talk about current, or at least current day.
See, I don't know if this broke the fourth wall for me. It's tapping on the glass for sure.
I think a large portion of the story is one of the characters is speaking directly to us, or at least reminiscing in our direction. It's almost a soliloquy running through. It's so in that way, yes, absolutely agree with you that there is a tapping on the glass, or at least a transparency, where there's almost an awareness of one of the characters that somebody is reading the story. If that makes sense.
Sure.
Yeah.
I guess my question, I was trying to encapsulate what I was feeling reading the finale of this story. Basically, when you find out the identity of the Grandmaster is literally the personification of the game.
Game of Die. Okay, that's kind of what I
Mhm.
figured you wanted to talk about, but I was not sure.
The fourth dimension entity that is the game.
The game existing as the rules of the game inside the game.
Yes,
Is
and
it
also
basically,
has existed and will always exist now that it is existing.
which we might need to talk about that too, because I was reading a review and they noticed something that I did not, and I'm wondering if you guys noticed it too. Anyways, to actually answer your question of like, I guess the question more to me feels like, do you enjoy that the game is its own like the game is the antagonist of the story? No, I don't even know if antagonist is the right word, but like I loved it. I guess is what I'm gonna going
It's
for.
the BBEG, the bad evil guy of this campaign,
Mhm.
is the campaign basically.
Yeah, I loved it. I'm super into it.
I think that I did like it. I also felt that it was anticlimactic in some ways. And I think that is what we were describing. Sometimes you just want that pitched battle where, good triumphs over evil, and they slay the dragon. What you don't want is for the dragon to actually then have it turns out that the dragon had a good reason for what it was doing all this time, and that makes the good guys the bad guys, and that isn't what happens here necessarily. But it does feel like they it helps the story in a lot of ways because it really pulls some of the strands together. We spent a little bit of time discussing Tolkien from Volume One, because he pops up quite early in Volume One, I'm pretty sure, and we weren't actually clear why they needed to have Tolkien in there. And Pat, from memory, you weren't particularly keen on Tolkien popping up, and fair enough.
Yeah, the use of it was a little heavy-handed for my taste, but yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that is kind of what we see again, is there is a little bit of heavy-handedness in how it's I don't know. I really liked it, but I also felt it was a bit maybe ham-handed how it was explained.
It felt to me like your example of a dragon that turned out not to be evil and was actually doing it for its own like benefit of others or whatever. I wouldn't have minded that. I wouldn't have minded a villain who didn't turn out to be as villainous. This felt like Kieron Gillen created this entity more to show the reach of RPGs, of TTRPGs, tabletop role-playing games, rather than actually having a villain for the story that he's writing. He opted for the look how powerful this medium can be, which is a cool thing to write about, and it is a powerful message. It just wasn't the story that I wanted to or was reading up until that point. At least that's what I felt.
Interesting, because I feel like it's been that story the whole time. So
Well, to some degree,
curious.
yeah. But this is just it, like set aside everything to say, "Wow, games are awesome." At the end,
I will agree with you that like when the game asks "What am I for?" and Ash does the big speech, I'm like, I'm not sure I needed the big speech. Like I kind of had already nailed it at that point in my head of like I get it, but at the same time, it's been set up really well. Like reading volume, I think that question first appears in volume 2.
Yep.
It might be volume 3, where like they intercept a transmission and it's "What am I for?" and they don't know who's saying it or where it's coming from. So I liked that foreshadowing, and like that's the thing too, where I think you definitely have been reading that story the whole time because it's been seeded for at least half to 3/4 of the story. So I don't know. I mean, I get it, but I kind of loved it.
and the fact that there's no actual resolution also bothers me. Like the evil is not defeated; it still exists. People can still fall into the world of die. Like nothing was solved at the end. They got to go home, which is nice, but that didn't do anything.
Yeah, welcome to real life, Pat. I get it. There's not quite as much the catharsis as you would like because they stand there and talk at each other, but like at the same time, it's a role-playing game.
If they didn't make it into a world-ending thing, it just turned. If it was like Jumanji, isn't a world-ending thing. It's a scary thing for those 5-6 people who are trapped there, and then there's crazy stuff happening in their town, and that's scary. They need to get out of it and live a normal life afterwards. But they turned this into a world-ending entity as opposed to just getting these 5 or 6 characters home to their families. You know what I mean?
They kind of discussed that actually, though, where it's like they assumed from the grandiose like statements being made that it was a world-ending thing, but they get there and then it's like, oh, the game is just going to exist and it'll continue to pull some people in, but like it's not literally going to be the end of time. It's just like the end of the game, which is the end of time for like this campaign and these players essentially.
Well, the game is whatever people need the game to be or expect the game to be, I guess. So if someone expects the game to be a world-ending event, it will then become that world-ending. Like the danger is still as ever present as it has ever been at the end of this.
Yes, which is kind of I feel like is kind of cool because like it's still out there and we could come back.
But I did think I think they did discuss that because I think it's Sol who says that the reason that the Grandmaster speaks that way is because that's how he always wanted his villains to be. He always wanted them to be taken seriously and things like that. And I think that I do agree with you, Pat. Is that this is a world-ending event, but I think that one thing that Die shows is that the bleeding goes one way, so to speak. So people arrive in Die, but none of Die's elements, apart from people going back without arms, they should have an arm, etc. None of it seems to go back the other way. So we don't have like panels of Fallen appearing in London, as the event gets closer or anything like that. It seems to be a one-way trip. So if the world of Die ends for those players, that specific world might pop out of existence, but that doesn't mean the real world, so to speak, is affected by anything that happens.
Yeah, it's
in
just
Die.
eating us.
It's all just an echo. It's just a shadow of it. Yeah.
Can we talk about, since it's related to this point, the bit where Saul realizes that he was basically commanding the game, like how to give him powers back when he died the second time, and he doesn't realize it until that scene happens in issue 18, and he realizes in issue 20 that basically like he was creating the rules of the game as the Grandmaster was talking to him. Like that scene was really brilliant to me, and that's where we were talking off mic about like I prefer physical books. Like, I would have loved to be able to just flip back through my physical pages and go back and read that scene, but it was digital, so I didn't do it at the
Well, they
time.
created the rules the first time he died. Like the instant that they left him and the
Exactly.
Grandmaster killed him.
Yeah,
That's
Yeah.
when he established what his game was.
yeah, and then the second time though, the Grandmaster kills him and is like, "I'm gonna give you this power," and he's like, "No, there has to be a price," and he's like saying like, "Oh, there must be a price," and like instead he's actually making it so there has to be a price.
Yeah, that was the first time. The second time was when Ash killed him.
He died 3 times, I believe, actually. Then
Yeah, he dies
I think he did.
He dies off camera before we even get into the story.
And then Ash
And then he
kills him.
dies again at the end of volume 1, and then he dies. No, that. But then
I
it
think
turns out
that's
that
it.
there's actually
No,
a
so he-
second death in between those two. Yeah.
he dies when he's pulled out of the portal and he turns into a fallen for the first time. Then he does his like adventure
Yeah.
off into the sea in the dungeon and gets killed again a second time. That's where the cool scene happens where he like is talking to the Grandmaster and the Grandmaster's like, "I'm gonna give you power," and he's like, "There has to be a cost," and the Grandmaster's like, "Sure, there's a cost now because you said that." And then Ash
He
kills him,
says,
and
"Of
that's the
course,
third
you are
one.
right." Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like the time stuff is completely, it's far too complicated. They didn't need to, it doesn't need to be an entity that exists throughout all time. That just complicates things far beyond what it needs to be for this story.
Yes, I agree with you. Actually, I think if we're going to talk about this entity that is ultimately just a reflection of who we are, etc., we didn't necessarily need the big complicated kind of thing of the 12 soldiers going back in time. You know, H.G. Wells popping up. I mean, we're obviously covering a lot of stuff, you know, sort of a little bit quickly, but
Previous, yeah.
there is a lot there that kind of, and not to say that it's unnecessary, but it did feel like it
I needed
it felt
another
like it was
volume.
overcomplicating. Yes, well, that was actually going to be a question I wanted to ask you guys: is did you feel like there is like a Shadow Volume 5 where you know, because Volume 3 ends, Volume 4 starts, but it does feel like there was maybe more. And I'm always a fan of a book that knows when it needs to end, but this
Mhm.
did feel like there was just maybe just a little bit somewhere that was missing.
Well, they have the cute thing that it's 20 issues, right?
Yeah.
That they need to know.
I mean, it's been
True.
4 volumes also since like the beginning, right? Like even on the back cover of volume 1, I think we pointed out that like it's 1, 2, 3, 4. Like we know, like I enjoyed that actually. Like, and the issues I think are 25 pages instead of like a normal 20 for a monthly comic. So you've kind of got 30 issues anyways. Is that how that math works? No, 24. Sorry, because you get like an extra issue per volume.
The extra
Yeah.
pages you're talking
Yeah,
about?
so you get it's
Yeah.
basically 24 issues of regular monthly comics at this point, but I do agree with you though that like the jump, especially from 3 to 4, because I read 4 by itself first for this podcast, and then I read and I was like,
Mhm.
wow, I don't remember some of this in like Ash's like voice like is can no longer use the voice like is has been muted, like that's a little weird, like I don't remember that really being discussed anywhere, but okay, it's fine.
Yes.
And then I read 1, 2, 3, and 4, and I was like, oh, okay, this still doesn't make that like there's still a gap here to me even then.
No, that was actually going to be something I wanted to touch on because we open on the boat. Okay, so Volume 4 starts with them sailing. They're in the realm of 13, and they're sailing on a boat that they've been given by Angria after the you know the events of the previous book. We see Ash being uh, uh,
Muzzled was the word I was looking for and couldn't find
muzzled,
earlier, yeah.
muzzled. Absolutely, that's a better choice of word. They put her on the boat, and then for some reason they keep her in the cells, which is never explained. It's never explained why they decided that Ash was the problem when all of them are guilty of being responsible for the situation that they're in. Every single one of them. I mean, we need to talk at some point about some very bad choices made in Volume 3 by these characters that pretty much ended in them having to sail across the world. So, you know, the why Ash is suddenly muzzled and in a cage is not quickly explained.
So I don't tweet a lot about stuff that I'm currently reading on the Matt Reads Comics Twitter account because I'm bad at Twitter. I don't do it that often. But the moment in volume 3 where Matt picks up the anger maul and dual wields. I was like so excited about that I had to tweet about it because it was just like
That was very
the
satisfying.
gamer nerd in me and like the oh my god shit's going on like narrative person in me like collided inside me, and they were so excited that they had to send a tweet, which I don't do very often. Just like, oh, that's what I really love about this comic is just the perfect, well, not perfect. It's probably not perfect, but like of the very, very good marriage of like narrative and game mechanics in a way that I don't think I've seen really in anything else, and like really trips that trigger for me as a person who is very invested in narrative
I
and
mean,
game mechanics.
it helps that he's writing his own game
I
mechanics.
mean, it helps. It does. We'll give you that.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely, there's definitely a mechanic in this, I would say, that gives characters the ability to break the rules of their own class, which I think is actually a good mechanic if you can do it well. Like I think D&D has what they call the rule of cool, which
Mhm.
is perhaps a bit subjective, but essentially, if your character is about to do something very cool, the DM has every right to kind of go, that fails for whatever reason. But sometimes it's better to let them succeed at something that's awesome than to really strictly. It is about ultimately it is about recognizing that there is a power fantasy, and sometimes it's good to allow that wish fulfillment. Not all the time. You do want there to be, because I think that's a big challenge sometimes with D&D groups. Is groups get really frustrated if they fail.
Yep.
They feel like I shouldn't fail. Like oh, this isn't fair. But you kind of go, there needs to be a failure so that that's the success sweeter. That makes the risk more real if you might not succeed. And so I did think that worked really well with Die, in that some of the characters are allowed to do things that perhaps they wouldn't have gotten away with previously.
Have we all been dungeon masters at some point or game masters?
Somewhat, yeah.
Jono, have you?
I have, yeah.
Okay, yeah, then all three of us have. Okay, cool. Yeah, I was just wondering. It was like because you were talking about the rule of cool stuff, and I was thinking specifically of some of the stuff we did in the one like Dun World campaign that I ran for a little bit, which Pat was a part of for a while. And it's like, yeah, I always lean on, especially because Dungeon World like really emphasizes in the source book, like, hey, let your characters do cool stuff, like challenge them, like make things hard, but like ultimately the game should be fun. People should be able to do cool stuff.
Yes.
Definitely leaned into that when we were running that. So
Well, I've been running, or I was running with groups in hibernation at the moment, but I was running a D&D campaign using the Acquisitions Incorporated source book, which is it's kind of like it provides rules for basically having a franchise. So it's this idea of that you can farm out adventuring to franchises, and the franchises are not necessarily equipped to deal with some of the things that they get sent their way, and they still have to pay their franchise fees and everything. But most recently, we did a Fast and the Furious ripoff episode. We basically had to
oh, nice. Oh, that's so good, Jono.
yeah. So it was really over the top ridiculous, and I did feel bad, but at the end of the so they were basically hired by this wizard to steal back his cart, and the way that and his horse. And the way that they were supposed to do that is they get on the cart and horse, and during the race, and they need to plant these orbs that will allow the wizard to basically get it back. But right at the end of the race, after they've successfully done it, and there was a lot of kind of room for, if the players don't succeed at this, I have other ways of letting them succeed. And I did feel bad, but the players assured me that they enjoyed it. But basically, at the end, it turns out that the cart doesn't belong to the wizard, and so they've basically helped this guy
Help him
screw his
steal
cousin over.
it. Nice.
But the worst part is that he destroys the cart accidentally because he gets his orbs mixed up. So one of them is a sphere of annihilation. So he unleashes it, and the cart just basically gets sucked up. And it was just describing the horse getting sucked into this orb, and the shrieking noises that it's making as it comes out the other side. And so now they've got that horse as part of their team, so to speak, and the horse is not nearly as well as it was. But I think that was a lot of fun, because I think that's kind of the rules of the world that we play in, is that the bad things will happen, but it's usually in a way that you don't see coming. So it's more, hopefully it's more fun than it is kind of And then the horse died.
Yeah. Yeah, actually when we got to the end of like our first sort of scenario in our campaign, and like the adventurers like busted in and they were like messing up the guy who was like going to be kind of the main bad guy for the campaign. And I think it was Kat who rolled really well, just like super well to like attack this guy essentially. And I was like, well, he can't die, but something like really bad has happened. So like basically I had decided that her attack like crippled him, and in such a way that like he was going to be like very mad at them specifically personally throughout the rest of the campaign in a way that I wasn't really prepared for him to be before. Like I was like, oh yeah, they're a thorn, like Team Rocket style Giovanni, like he's kind of a thorn in their side, like they're a thorn in his side, but like he doesn't really specifically care about them, but like Cat fucked him up. So at that point I was like,
Now
oh,
he
he has taken
does.
a personal interest in them now. Like this makes the campaign much more interesting.
Fantastic. Yes, I think that that's a good example of that is kind of making the stakes a bit more personal. Which, I mean, I guess in Die, the stakes are both impersonal and very, very personal in some ways. Like, I don't think they particularly care about saving the world of Die. Like, I think that becomes clear. They're happy to.
I don't know if that's true. Like
I-
that's spread between the characters, right? Like one of the reasons I really like Izzy is Izzy's like, hey, we broke this world in volume one and we need to figure out how to fix it before we leave. And I'm like, okay. Like that's a reasonable opinion to have. Whereas Chuck's just like, whatever, it doesn't matter, essentially.
which we find out why Chuck doesn't necessarily want to go back to the real world.
Yep.
And also interestingly, why he cannot allow himself to show even a moment's sincerity, like full stop.
Yeah.
But I would say Izzy might be the only member of the party who actually cares about the world of Die. Sol cares about it from the perspective of somebody who wants to use it as a playing field.
Yeah, it's his toys, right? And if you break his toys, he's mad. But other than that, not really.
Exactly, exactly. And more underneath the surface, perhaps, as we find out, without going too far ahead. Chuck just wants a place that he can have fun, or more on that as well. Matt wants desperately to get home, and Matt seems prepared to do whatever it will take to get home. Uh, Angela, I think, once she finds her daughter, which I was a little bit confused by. Again,
Well, it's the timey-wimey stuff that you and Pat are both not into, and I enjoyed, but that's okay.
I like it on the surface, but if you think about it at all, it starts to hurt.
It falls
yeah,
apart a little bit, but I don't think it. I think it holds together well enough, and I enjoy. I think I've talked to you about this, Pat. Like I enjoy circular time travel stories where the stuff in the past had to happen for the stuff in the future to happen, but the stuff in the future has to happen for the stuff in the past to happen. Like
Well,
I
then
enjoy. I
how does the
enjoy that.
very end make any
What was
sense to
that?
you then? Sorry, how
What?
does the very end make any sense to you then?
That I'm not sure about. We have to talk about
It's
that.
no longer a circular time story.
there's a fantastic sketch done by an Australian sketch group, and it's the guy's Time Knight. And he's a guy who essentially he discovers the ability to travel through time, kills Hitler, becomes a hero. Also, turns out that he's his own father, and so
When that
he's
happens.
he's he's stuck in the position he doesn't want to be his own father because he's not a fan of time incest, but he also can't go back and stop it because otherwise World War II happens. Yeah, it's. I'll share that with you guys, just in terms of Ouroboros time travel. But yeah, it's done quite well.
So should we talk about? I guess we're gonna jump ahead, but I don't think that's a big deal because I think the other two questions we have are much more abstract, and I'm not sure how focused they'll be on the actual story. But we'll see. Should we talk about the fact that Saul still has a die at the end?
Yeah, yeah, that is an interesting one. Because that is right at the end. That is, it's all for you. Is the final line of the comic book? I think.
Yeah. So I hadn't noticed until I read it in a review that on page, I guess it's
He
131
doesn't
of
put
this
his
volume.
die in the box.
Yeah, there are only 5 die laying there, and I totally skipped completely over it when I was looking at it. But there
He's
they are.
even
There's only
picking it
5.
up in the panel.
Yep.
He's picking his die up.
So he must have sent something back to himself, right?
No, I don't think so. So the box that was originally sent to him in the past that started the game now doesn't have a D20.
Mm-hmm.
So they broke
So
the timeline.
they didn't actually close the circle then, right?
Yeah.
So
So
Die's
everything
still
that's
out there
happened.
waiting to
No,
will itself into existence.
well, hang on. No. I am going to disagree because he had the D20 in his eye socket, and there are still the 5 die on the ground that he's picking up to put in the box, presumably.
Ah, yeah,
So
we
I would
need
say he
6 die
has sent the
though.
D6 die. Oh, yes. No, you're absolutely right. Then no, there are 5 die on the floor. Oh no, he's got one in his hand, so he has picked one up. But I think he always had the D20 in his socket because the Grandmaster hammers it in there,
But one
as we
of them
find
is
out
not
in this volume.
a magic die, and one is.
But that was the Grandmaster's die. The Grandmaster put his D20 in the one eye socket, and he put a D4, I think, in the other eye socket. And when he gives Ash the D4 he gives her the Grandmaster's D4 in Volume 3. Ash's son looks at it and says, "There's no magic in this," and that
I
was
think
when we
that
first
one.
start to see the unraveling.
So that one is also a D20. Yeah, yeah. But he does still have a
Okay,
D20 in his eye in this panel here right after that. So I don't know about the 5 die and the one at the end, but like he does still have a die
I
in his eye on that same page. So maybe that's actually nothing now that I'm looking at it. Maybe he still did just send it to himself.
I think
It's
he did send.
weird
Oh,
to not put it on the
yeah.
ground there though.
Well, I think he wouldn't be able to see if he didn't have the D20 in his eye.
Well, the Grandmaster's die was just a toy.
Yep. But like that
Grandmaster's die
one's
was
gone
just a toy,
anyways,
yeah.
right?
I
Because
don't know.
he throws that one
I think
away. So
so.
in the panel when he comes back from, oh, hang on, oh, that's interesting. No, that might just be just an illustration issue. But when he comes back to life, you can see his eye socket. There is a dice in there, although
Yeah,
it
he
looks more
definitely
like
does still
a
have it.
triangular shape. Yeah, there's a D20 in the next panel. Never
I
mind.
Alright,
mean,
so I think
it would be the facet of a D20.
he
Yeah,
did send it to himself, and it was just in his hand at the time.
he's picking it up in the panel when he has the box. So he's got the D. He's got a dice in his hand. None of them have a D12, do they?
It's what 4, 8, 6,
I can see the 4. I can see the
and
8. I can see the 6.
I think
Eight
there
Is
is
there
a
a D10?
12. Now I'm flipping to the front of
Okay,
the book.
cool.
Hang on. Look at this. Get into
this
this
is this is
minutia. This is what the
this
people
is how
came
deep we
for.
go into it. Yeah, this is
Okay,
it.
so it's 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 20.
Yes. So he's got the 20 in his hand. I can see the 12. I can see, yeah, they're all there.
Yeah, alright. Bullshit aborted. They did summon die into existence.
What I think that is a great question because that is exactly kind of that is one of the key issues is they kind of accept that it has to exist. And like as Pat said, they've gone through all of this to get to this point, and yet they still send it back. And they even make a note of that where they say it's the opposite of impossible, it's necessary.
That's the thing, right? Is like there's theoretically infinite number of these games going on. We saw Lovecraft looking at that chamber of fallen essentially. Like the game is gonna
Mm-hmm.
exist at some point. It's not gonna exist. So like you're just like throwing the responsibility onto someone else at that point. And I don't think that's something that this group would do for the most part.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, like, if you look at Volume 3, we meet H.G. Wells, and his argument is I stopped war. I made a game that was against war, and by doing so, I saved the world, and you've now doomed the world by coming in and breaking the stalemate. This is your fault. And then they point out, well, actually, no, because your game inspired other games, which, in the very circular way, it all came back to war. I mean, ultimately it all came back to conflict. No matter what you did, this was always going to happen. And they even say like, oh, does that mean World War I will be our fault if we don't stop it? And it's like, no, it was always going to happen. It's just what else happens as a result of it, perhaps.
Yeah, which the book is very interested in choices that kind of have no effect but weigh heavily on your character regardless, right? And like this is the biggest
Mm-hmm.
one of it doesn't really matter what they do cuz like die's going to happen. There's infinite number of people playing infinite number of role-playing games throughout time. Like this game will itself into existence with some campaigns group. So the only choice is like, do you want to be the ones responsible or not?
Which is sort of
Yeah.
ironic. There is a term in TTRPGs where character choice is not having any effect on the campaign. It's called railroading, and it's looked down upon primarily.
See, but it's not.
But
So they're not
Absolutely.
really railroaded here so much as
the
they're like.
choices have no meaning.
I mean, it does have meaning. It has internal meaning, which I think is like a big part of the book, right? Of you, the thing will happen, but like whether you like how you choose to make it happen or like what choices you make leading up to it still matter because they show what kind of person you are. So the choice still matters a lot to these people. Like they took this burden upon themselves.
Matt is a fan of railroading. We're hearing it here,
That's not
folks.
what I mean. But like, I mean, as a
We are
reader,
there
you
to play
feel like
Matt's
the
story.
choice matters still, right? Like it doesn't. You don't get to that point, and you're like, oh, this doesn't matter at all. Or am I wrong?
In a railroaded campaign, you're talking
I'm
about?
talking about for this story where they get to the point where they have to make the choice of like whether they're going to essentially do what the Grandmaster wants and let die summon itself into existence throughout time. Like the choice still matters, even though it doesn't matter, right? Like you still care about what
I,
they're gonna do.
I thought that it already had. Like it said, I came into existence 6 seconds ago, and therefore I've always been. Like they didn't have a choice.
Well, there were still
I
two things
think,
they could have done to stop it, but they did the things instead.
yeah, they didn't need to send the dice back. That's right.
Oh, I suppose. Yeah.
But I do think they even talk about the idea of choice when they're fleeing down the tunnel away from. Uh,
I do want to
where
do
are
a
we?
aside about that whole Minds of Moria
Please do.
bit.
Yeah,
Oh God, I'm so happy that we're just. I knew when we were gonna discuss this book, I was like, we can try the discussion questions bit, but it's not gonna take because there's so much in this
I'm
book.
so
It's so
sorry.
dense. I love it. No, I literally have been excited to talk about this book for 4 months. So this is what I wanted. It's all for us.
Yes, yeah. Well, it is exactly. First of all, I loved the Minds of Moria scene in the film.
Of
Um,
course you did,
Lord of the
Jono.
Rings.
Of course you did.
It was an incredible scene. I thought it was well shot. I thought that the monster that drives them into the Mines of Moria is beautiful. I think
The art's
everything that happens
amazing
with
throughout this entire
Gandalf.
volume.
Oh no, sorry, I'm talking strictly
We're
just
talking about
about
the
the Mines of
movie,
Moria
right?
in the
Yeah.
Lord of the Rings. And so
Oh,
as soon as they touch down in front of the mine, and I think this is a compliment to Stephanie Hans's art. I mean, I can't say enough good things about her art, to be honest. But as soon as they touched down, I knew where they were. As soon as there were tentacles in the water, I knew that there was going to be a Lord of the Rings. This was going to be the. I mean, I think just from the scene where they teleport into that initial thing, I could see the door in the one frame. That was enough to know that this was going to be a Minds of Moria riff.
Can we talk about how stupidly seamless the tentacle monster into the Tolkien dungeon transition is? Because it's great, right? Like as someone who would, I guess is trying to reverse engineer, how do you get from Lovecraft to like Tolkien dungeon? Like it's such a perfect way to transition it of like, oh okay, the monster in the lake is a Cthulhu monster. Easy, did it.
Yes, absolutely.
Done.
Um, and it does give Matt another great moment. Matt has a lot of great moments in this in the series, volume 1 to 4. Questionable choices, which I think we've kind of touched on, but I think he has some great moments, and this is another fascinating moment for him.
Yeah, it is just like absurd how specifically tailored this world is to fucking them up mentally, right?
Exactly.
I mean, it's what they wanted.
Yeah. Well, that's, I mean, right from the beginning, they didn't want hokey fantasy. They wanted something where their decisions mattered. Volume 1, that's what they all said, and then they got exactly what they wanted.
I think this is when I step forward and say I wasn't a big fan of the Minds of
Wasn't a big
Moria.
That's fair. Like down to the 20-sided dice on the door as it opens.
I mean, the design of this comic book is gorgeous, regardless of what choices they made in the story. It's illustrated
Hmm.
beautifully. But I felt like this last volume was rushed, especially the final few, like resolution where our characters are. And like you were saying, the beginning felt rushed, like there was bits of the story that was missing. I felt like this Minds of Moria bit could have been shortened, or it really seems to go on for a bit.
Absolutely. I think it's like the bottom third of the book is just the Minds of Moria, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's strange to me because the Tolkien die, or the side of the die we've already done. This is
It was
Lovecraft,
weird
right?
to go back to it, right? Like,
We're back to Tolkien.
Mm.
We've already done Tolkien.
yeah,
And you could
no,
say
I
it's
agree with
because the
that for sure.
characters are like a huge fan of Tolkien, which is fine, but it sort of is breaking the established rules that we have of this world, that all of a sudden, in the middle of this Lovecraftian horror, oh, look, it's the Minds of
Yeah, we
Moria.
backpedal. Yeah, that was a little bit strange.
I
That's
was
an
lost,
excellent
and all of a
point.
sudden, the villain is Ash's closeted gender dysmorphia as the Balrog, which is an interesting concept, I admit, but felt strange added here at the end, and it felt rushed. They solve the issue really quick. It's there and then
Yeah.
it's gone.
And I think that almost does disrespect to the gravity of what's being grappled with as well. Like it's not a quick resolution. It's not an easy thing that you can resolve. But I guess at the same time, I guess they might argue that Ash has technically been grappling with this since first
For
going into
sure.
Die.
Yeah.
But I definitely agree with you that it felt rushed. And to your point, I hadn't even considered, but it breaks the rules massively because each master has their own realm, and we've already seen where Tolkien's realm is. So how does this, unless they've fallen all the way through 13
I'm
back
gonna
into
say
Tolkien's
you
realm, which
could
we don't
hand wave it
know.
by like they're inside of Die. They could technically be underneath the
Why
Tolkien
is
realm.
Tolkien? I guess, but
You could hand wave it that way. I agree that it's odd that you're circling back around though. I will give you that.
if he hadn't done Tolkien in Volume One, this would have been better. I feel, but the fact that he did Hobbits in a Trench earlier, this is lessened.
Blunts it a little bit. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And it's not like there aren't other authors that have covered the horrors of World War I that could have been used in Volume 1 to make space for Tolkien in Volume 4.
True.
I mean, C.S. Lewis famously, like, also somebody who saw the horrors of World War I and came home and wrote, you know, escapist fantasy fiction because that was how they wanted to process this idea of this awful war. And C.S. Lewis doesn't even get C.S. Lewis gets a mention but doesn't get a realm
Yeah.
in Die.
I would be surprised if C.S. Lewis isn't like a different answer or like a different master somewhere else that we just didn't get to, which that is kind of a thing that you guys have talked a lot about how you feel like there's more that we could have explored. The fact that we only get like four masters, or is that right? I think it's only four, is a
Yeah, something
little
like that.
like
I'm
it's
okay with having blank spaces, especially because he's developing a game to go along
yeah, I
with this.
think going through 20 of them would have been absurd, right? But like the fact that
Yeah.
we do just get a slice of it, which is good and bad. I think it's good in that like it's very dense. I think it's bad in that like I guess it's a high compliment to be like I could have used some more though. I could have used some more slices.
I don't think. I mean, especially as you say, it's limited in the masters we see. Doubling up on them is just not
Yeah, I agree.
necessary.
I wonder if that's potentially just because Moira is just like the most famous dungeon in existence. So that if you're gonna do a dungeon, that's the one you riff on. It might be that. I don't know. But like you're right, it's odd.
I think we have kind of touched on this before in a different way, but is Moria the dungeon? Is it the proto dungeon, the proto dungeon crawl? I mean, I'm racking my brains to think of other fantasy before Lord of the Rings that had done that kind of that delving into the deep and finding something
I think it is.
horrifying.
And I do know from having read some interviews that part of the reason that Moira was the choice is that the first three quarters of it, whatever, are quiet. So basically, the
Mm.
characters are just sitting with themselves. And I think at this point, Gillen was like, I just want the characters to sit with themselves because they're like the actual quote unquote enemies here. Like they're just grappling with all the stuff that has happened to them and the choices they've made since they came back. and figuring out what
Definitely.
the heck to do.
Mm.
So I think that's
But
part of the choice also.
yeah, but I think Pat, to your point, I like if it was always planned to be 4, then I guess we can't adequately say that it was rushed, but it still feels like it was. I always feel like Volume 2 ends. So I think it might be helpful for listeners. Volume 1, they arrive and die. Decide that the only way to get out is to destroy the rules, is to break the rules. They break the rules. This really upsets Soul. They kill Soul, who comes back as a fallen. They all go, all right. Well, now that we've done this, we can go back. But two of the members of the group decide they want to stay for different reasons, which means it's impossible for them to return. The rules, as established in Volume 1, are to leave, die, everybody has to want to go. Which, I mean, there's a few times that they're all together that it feels like they could have probably achieved that from Volume 2 on. But anyway, Volume 2 starts with the party is split. Um, Matt, Ash, and Angela decide that they're going to take over Angria and use that as the base of operations to catch the other two, and they have Soul with them as a prisoner. Volume 2 ends with them having taken over Angria. Well, no, do they end up in jail in Angria?
Yeah.
Both of those happen actually.
Yes.
So they end
Sorry,
up in
yes.
jail, but then Izzy and Zamorna show up, and they essentially, with Ash, stage a coup and take over Angria.
Yes, that's right. And then Zamona is quite an interesting character, but that's a whole other discussion there, but which feeds into some of Ash's repression, I think. But Volume 3 starts with war because Little England, which is the second or third England, I guess it's almost all of these are just England in some form.
They're all
which
just
makes
kind of
sense.
smushed together inside one facet of the die. There's in England, it feels like, but there's different
Yeah,
sections of it because they talk about later, at least we're not kicking hobbits in the face. At least it's some.
yeah,
At least we're fighting something that we can feel decent about fighting.
exactly. Yeah. So Volume 3 is the war, which ends with victory, but but also not victory because they don't manage to stop the machine that's making the die, which is part of Prussia. If I sound confused, it's because I'm trying to really brush over some fairly important plot details.
Yeah, it's
But
hard to go quick, right? Because honestly, for as much as we're talking about, man, it would be nice if there was more in here. The thing's pretty dense for being 20 issues, and I think part of that's the 5 extra pages per issue. But a lot happens in this book in a way that. So I was thinking about this versus another Kieron Gillen book, The Wicked and the Divine, and that feels much more spaced out to me, where I can kind
Yeah.
of tell you there are arcs and they're kind of slow and everyone gets their moment and there are beats and this is just it's very packed in a way that I think that The Wicked and the Divine isn't, and is interesting coming
Well,
from the same writer.
I didn't have a problem with the pacing up until this last volume. I felt this last volume was trying to do too much in its
Yeah,
it felt it
plot
felt very
effects.
revelation packed. Like there was a revelation every few pages, and there isn't really space to process one revelation before the next one kind of starts, so to speak.
Well, and yeah, the characters making decisions or coming to terms with things that they've been battling with, they do so quickly.
Mm-hmm.
It's just
Mm-hmm.
hard to. Oh, that just happened. Oh, they're okay with that. Oh, okay. What? Oh, all right. Now there's a being of infinite power and of all reality. Cool. Let's. Oh, and they're home. Sweet. Okay.
the one thing you mentioned that I did want to bring up again, because I think I agree with you, is so Ash grappling with the literal ashness of
Balrog of
herself.
sexuality. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that to me
Mm-hmm.
felt so.
On the nose.
Yeah, in a way that a lot of the story isn't. And I actually still really liked that scene, especially for I really loved when Matt Sword is "Oh man, she," and then doesn't quite finish the sentence because it can't lie, it can only be mean. I really dug that. But at the same time, it was very obvious in a way that a lot of the other stuff they face in this world that's trying to draw their inner conflicts out of themselves to being outer conflicts isn't. So that was a little odd to me. I still liked that scene, but it didn't quite fit in the same way. So I definitely get your gripe with that, if that makes
It's
sense.
it's more her turning into Ash the White within seconds. or within like 2
Yep.
pages. It's just
It
like,
does go a
oh,
little quickly. Yeah, I like that did feel to me like a thing where because Ash's narration stops in that issue, right? And then it picks up again. That felt
yeah.
like a thing to me
Yep.
that should have been an issue break, where the narration stops and then it picks up again, like at the start of the next issue, and you're like, "Oh shit, she's alive."
Well, I mean, I'm pretty sure in
That
Lord of
being
the
in the
Rings
same issue is weird.
it takes Gandalf like almost an entire book to show
Months,
up
right?
again.
Yeah.
It's like
Months and months. He wanders for outside of time. He says,
he forgets who he
so
is.
exactly.
Yeah, which we certainly don't have that kind of time in this 20 issue series, but for it to be in the same issue did feel a little bit rushed to me. Yes.
And I mean, I agree with you on every point. I think it was an important, it was obviously an important part of Ash's character,
Mhm.
and it was obviously an important part of the journey. And that it was rushed was a disservice. Well, not rushed, but it did feel like a disservice to the discussion that Ash needed to have internally. But then again, I mean, more ink and more panels spent on that than the final confrontation with the Grandmaster.
Yeah. And I don't know, it's something that she's been like we, especially as readers, have been seeing her deal with that the entire story too. So I think this being kind of the conclusion of that to me, especially with the monologue turning off, like that to me kind of made sense in a way. Like this isn't
Mhm.
just, hey, we're gonna have this fight and it's out of nowhere. It's been building for I don't remember exactly what issue that was, but let's say 17 issues, right? So it didn't really come out of nowhere to me, but for it to be for the conclusion to be that quick, and I would say it's not concluded. Like nothing's actually concluded. Like Ash just has a better handle on it, I think, than she did before.
I think that's a fair read. So I mean, we start volume one. We meet Ash. Ash is a 40-something-year-old man.
Mhm.
Well, no, when we first meet Ash, this is when they first go to Souls to play
Yeah,
the game. So we
they're
first meet Ash when he's
teens.
17. Yeah, and then we then the story jumps ahead and we meet Ash returning from Die, and then the story jumps ahead again. I think we made mention of that. There's two time jumps in like the first 10 pages.
Yeah.
Um, and so we meet Ash when he's a 40-year-old man. It's his birthday. He goes through the motions of his birthday. He doesn't like his birthday because he associates it when they first went to Die. And then they get sucked back into the game, and suddenly Ash is a woman. And at one point, Chuck even goes, "Are we ever going to talk about the fact that you look the way you do?" Something along those lines. And there's, I think it's even Izzy actually comes to Ash's defense at that point, and that's kind of like the first kind of glimpse that we get that there is more to Ash than potentially we've been led to believe.
Well, the fact that she has a child in this world, right?
Yep.
Yes,
Like I think I
yes,
texted
exactly.
Matt when I saw the page turn and that character called her mother. It's like, what?
Damn. Yeah.
But even the story behind that is quite, like, because we find out about Zamona, who is this. It's fair to call him a sexual predator,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
vampires are sexual predators. It's always been how like there's the dark, mysterious, visceral.
Seducer. Yeah.
Exactly, and who does that, and who that's actually one of the causes of conflict between Ash and Izzy. Um, is Zamona, because Zamona seduces Ash, who says that they allow it to happen, but the truth is, I mean, sexual predators are they're always going to be the worst. Um, and impregnates her, and then Izzy comes to the rescue once again. So we're kind of we also see that relationship with Izzy and Ash. I really didn't like Izzy in the first volume because I felt like Izzy was very self-righteous,
Yep.
and I still don't know if I like Izzy a lot, but I certainly understand Izzy a lot better at the conclusion of Die than I did potentially at the start.
I think Izzy ends up being potentially my favorite member of the party, actually, because she's been trying so hard in the years between adventures to like not be the shitheel she was the first time. Like, I don't know that like Izzy doesn't make the correct choices throughout the entire thing because no one does. It's Die, but like I really enjoy Izzy like trying to not be like Izzy and Chuck are the exact opposite, right? Like Chuck is stuck in Die and has been the same shit-heel teenager he's been the whole time, partly as a result of like he had to be that person to survive mechanically in
Hmm.
Die. And
Hmm.
Izzy has like been trying to change and not be that person in the intervening years. So I don't know. I really enjoyed Izzy throughout especially like volumes 2 through 4.
I think that I think I agree with you, and I think the way that Izzy talks to the gods changes from volume 1 to volume 4. Like, I think what started as a very adversarial relationship, she became the god binder because she wanted a cleric who controlled the gods, not a cleric who would ask for
Such
favors.
a
And
teenage
I
thing to
think that
do, right? Of like, hey, I'm just gonna make you do what I want.
exactly. And then by volume 4, there's much more give and take. Sometimes to the detriment of her friends and the people around her. But she tries a lot harder, at least, to find middle ground.
Yeah, absolutely.
I
Did we
guess.
answer
I
your
mean,
question, Pat?
We talked about what I wanted to talk about, so yeah, I'll take it.
but overall, I mean, Pat, what would you rate Die? Like, if you had to give it a 5-star rating, the entire
Of
story,
the
not just
series,
volume 4. Yeah,
probably 4 stars.
I think that's probably where I would sit with it as well. It's very good, but I agree with you. There's definitely moments where it feels like there's also like, 'cause you talked about the meta commentary. There's definitely sometimes moments where it feels like there's almost like too much effort to put in a quip or a snarky something, and that undercuts sometimes the beautiful story
Yeah,
that you're seeing. So yeah, and it's not disappointing, but it feels like,
needs to
yeah,
prove how clever it is at times, which is unnecessary.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah, I could definitely feel that. But I
But I
think
think
that goes with Kieron Gillen's writing style. I think he just likes. He's a red man. He's done his research, and I think he's enjoying putting it pen to paper. So,
yeah, yeah. I mean, like the creative team is incredible. So
oh
we've
yeah, it
got
was a
we've got
powerhouse. I hope they keep doing stuff together.
not that our criticism of the story isn't valid, but I mean, it's certainly, even a false note is still so beautifully done, and it's such an interesting story that I wanted to read it all the way to the end, even when there were bits that were kind of going, this bit doesn't quite work for me, or so on.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
All right, I think we should take mine next because I think Jono's is going
Oh
to be the
yeah.
most existential. Mine's only mildly existential. So,
I mean, ultimately, what we want to do for a comics podcast is we want people to have to really consider the nature of their existence.
I mean, welcome to my therapy session now. We're starting now.
Well,
Uh,
that is something that I want to get into, definitely. But I think let's start with the question.
yeah, so my question is, can you go home again?
What does that mean, man?
I mean, actually, so I was kicking some stuff around, and this specific question is kind of on my mind because my wife Kat and I are going to try this later this year, and we'll find out whether you can go home again. Because we're moving from where we live now to a place that we lived a while ago, and I at the very least really enjoyed, and hopefully it will be good. But I also was trying to pack a few different, like in true die form, I was trying to pack a few different questions into one question. You can turn this around and look at it, and there are a few different facets to it. So the first one is, I guess, like, do you guys like? I really enjoyed the first volume of Die. I think you guys also did. We at the very least had a pretty good discussion about it. We're having a pretty good discussion about volume 4. Like, I think this series holds up throughout. Like the issues that we've noted, like regardless, I really enjoyed this series to the point where I think it's one of my favorite series. Maybe full stop.
Really?
I don't really power rank the comics actually. Like
Ah!
contrary to what contrary to my usual impulses. Like I like a lot of different things for a lot of different reasons, but like if I was going to take 10 series, 20 series to a desert island, like I would potentially take this because there's just so much. It's so dense and like it hits so many of my specific things that I like because it's a comic talking about games, talking about like narrative, talking about choices, and like I don't know. So this is like top 20 for me potentially. So I really enjoyed it all the way throughout, and I guess I was kind of wondering like, do you guys feel the same? Do you feel like it held up? Can you go home again? Is it the same as volume one?
So home is. I'm confused.
This is only facet one of the question, Pat. I've got three questions at least packed
So
into this one
facet one is
question.
how.
This is question 2A. Do you feel like it held up in comparison to volume 1? Did you enjoy the story, I guess, as a whole unit?
I mean, as a whole, while you were gone, Jono and I talked about what we would score this out of 5. I would give it a 4. The series
Okay.
itself.
That's a solid
Uh,
score.
yeah, I think it's a very good series. I would recommend to anyone that has any interest in D&D or fantasy. Um, I think that the story in volume 1 felt stronger than it did in volume 4. So
Okay.
I think that's where I'll leave it.
So can't go home again.
There is no home. No.
All right, Jono, what do you think?
I think very similar to Pat. I think it's a very strong story throughout. I think it hits some false notes, which we've kind of covered. And I think that when it's always difficult because it sounds like you don't like something because you are mentioning it in a criticism, but I think to understand when I say it hits a false note, I mean there are books out there that I would stop reading halfway through. There are books that I've read a few chapters of and I've given up because I've hated the prose or because I've just been unable to get into the story. And I think when we talk about this comic book, I mean, we do need to obviously talk about Kieron Gillen as the writer, but I think, Stephanie Hans is the artist, and I'm reading the names now because I think that everybody here has done a great job. But Clayton Cowles is the letterer, Rian Hughes is the designer, and Chrissy Williams is the editor. And I think, when I say it's a 4 out of 5, there are a lot of issues with the story, but I think that it's a testament to the strength of the story overall that the false notes don't ruin it. They stick out slightly, but they don't spoil anything about the overall story. It's a very strong story about grief, about loss, about endurance, and about games, ultimately game theory, and that's very interesting to me. Yeah, but Volume 4 is, in my opinion, not nearly as good as Volume 1. Volume 1 is a very, very strong entry to the series. Volume 2 really continues that. I said that there were some missteps in Volume 3 that I kind of felt were a bit strange. And then Volume 4, as I've said, there were a few bits that felt rushed and that stuck out. And so, if I was to grade them individually, you'd probably have a 5 out of 5 for Volume 1, and then everything thereafter would be 4 out of 5.
Yeah, and I think that's
Yeah.
fair. I think all the points you guys have brought up are like completely valid points and good criticism of the material. We didn't even really talk about the fact that like it kind of handholds you for a little bit when the Grandmaster is over explaining things at the end. Maybe we kind of touched on it, but we didn't really like get up into it that like the comic is kind of explained to us at this point that yes,
All
we needed.
mysteries laid bare. Yeah.
Yeah, and so like it just kind of it does sort of explain it away that this is the sort of quote unquote villain that Saul would create. So like of course it's gonna over dramatize.
Monologue. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. We talked about
Mhm,
that a little
mhm.
bit, but like we didn't quite get around to saying that like yeah, those are pages that especially when we feel like we're missing other pages, maybe those didn't have to happen. So like I don't think I would call it a 5 out of 5 comic because I'm not even sure that exists, but like I think 4 out of 5 is still pretty darn good. And again, for me it's specifically hitting stuff that I think works for me and like is stuff I'm super interested in and some like other readers might not be. Like as I was going to refill my water and stuff, Kat was like, "Should I read this?" And I was like, "You should read it. I don't know if you'll like it as much as I like it."
I think that's probably a very good um, indicator on it, though. Is I think that really good art will speak to people, but it can't speak to everyone because ultimately, stuff that's too broad that can speak to everybody ultimately will be quite shallow, whereas something that's quite something that reaches a particular audience very well is probably something that's quite niche at the same time, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, absolutely. I think it's Mark Rosewater of Magic who was saying that like if you aim for something that pleases everyone, you're going to get like a C plus C minus design, and if you aim for something that's going to please a specific audience, you're going to get an A plus design from those people and like an F from other people, and it's still better to do that than to do the C plus C minus design where everyone's just kind of like, whatever, because then no one cares, as opposed to at least some people care. So I guess the second facet of the question to me is I just kind of wanted to talk about the fact that the characters go from die back to the real world, back to die where they have to grapple with their choices and die, back to the real world again, and kind of the impact that had on them, and even the changes we see them like discussing and even like I guess actually doing within themselves as they're in the world of die. Like I kind of wanted to talk about Izzy's stuff a little bit, which we hit on a little already, so we don't have to go super deep on that. Where they essentially like create a humanitarian disaster, and Izzy's instinct is, "Oh, we can't leave, guys, because we just destroyed these people's home." That sort of thing, I guess, is what I want to talk about. Where it's like these what 40 something people 30 something people have brought their teenage bullshit back with them into die, and it's weird to see them grappling with the consequences of what they did when they were people who didn't understand how consequences work essentially, because like teenagers
Mhm.
don't entirely understand how consequences work, right? We can agree on that.
I think that is a very well documented phenomenon, and it's not a solely psychological. I think there's a lot of physiological stuff at work there as well.
Yeah, so I guess it's just wanted to talk about like, was it interesting to you guys seeing these quote unquote real people interacting with the quote unquote fake consequences in their fantasy world as though they were real? Because it was to me.
Well, interestingly, isn't Ash the only one that has any other like real consequences to what she did the previous time she was in Die? Like, does anyone else have like ramifications of what their stupid teenage actions did 30 years later?
Not entirely, actually, now that you bring it up. I think the closest is when Izzy has to read her diaries because they've become the
Yeah.
foundation of her religion in volume 2, which was
Hmm.
a cool scene. I really enjoyed that scene.
Sure. I mean, honestly, it would lessen the shock of Ash's having a son, but shouldn't Chuck have kids all over the place?
You would think, right?
I do. Sorry, I do think that Angela sees a lot of consequence because she makes a deal with the Fae for her abilities. But that all happens off screen, but we know that it cost her an arm, literally, when she goes back to the real world, and we know that there are all sorts of other consequences. She's basically addicted to Fae gold. So I think that there's definitely like what seemed like a cool character concept when she was 17 actually turns out to be a debilitating, um, like life altering mess as she gets older, I guess.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, and Angela also has the thing which kind of is like sidelined for a bit with Case, also the dog,
Yeah.
where
Yep.
she says it's like it's so stupid, but at the same time, like it's kind of all she's been thinking about since they came back at that point. I think it's in volume 2 also.
It does seem like she never dealt with the grief of losing her animal. And then she does kind of deal with it in volume 2, and then in volume 3 she gets Molly, and that becomes like another thing. She has trouble letting go, sometimes to the real detriment of the group.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. To the point where two different people are potentially going to kill her daughter for her in volume 4,
Yeah.
which is a rough go of
um
it.
to answer your question, I guess yes, I found it very interesting. I found the I think I think Pat is absolutely right. We mostly only saw Ash really suffering any kind of consequence or kind of having to deal with anything. I I think we've touched on briefly, but there's obviously a whole storyline about the previous ruler of, or the current ruler of Angria, Zamona. No, he's deposed in
Yeah.
Yep.
volume
Yeah.
2. But there's a whole storyline there about how basically there was a bit of a contest for his affection between Izzy and Ash, which Ash came out successful, but the consequence of which is that Ash has had this child. The consequence of that is that Izzy was never going to be able to have children, as we find out. But I mean, we don't know enough about Izzy's life in real life to know if that has or has not actually been a consequence, because she has become a
She
teacher
says, right, that
and
she never really wanted to have kids, and I think that sound like it seems true to me if that statement
sure.
makes sense, because I think lots of people in this book say things that are not necessarily true, but that seemed like a true statement to me at the time.
But we also see that she's quite popular with her students, because I think there's a great little transition panel in volume 4 that shows, maybe it's volume 3, that shows there's a new teacher in the classroom, and one of the girls has written, where's Miss Jenkins? um, because we kind of get to see glimpses of what life is, what's happening outside of die. Or did I
Yeah.
imagine that?
No, that's true. And actually, those are exclusive to the trades, apparently, too. I found out while I was doing
Really?
my research for this volume. Yeah, those weren't in like the individual issues. They're just kind of bonus sketches.
Oh, nice. They work very well.
No, they're very cool to the point where I kind of feel bad for the single issue people because they're missing out on those, and they're like neat little character beats that you get in the interstitials.
And I guess following on from that, I mean, obviously going home again with new knowledge is what happens at the end of volume 4. So Ash arrives home to his partner and says, there's so much that we need to talk about, and she says, likewise. I guess, how do we feel about that? How do you feel about that kind of homecoming where, you're not the person, you're coming home to people, but you're not the person that they may have thought you were anymore? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And that also kind of ties into the fact that I wanted to talk about the fact that so many people get happy endings in this story, or like happy-ish endings, even though they're changed as a result of the journey for sure. It's very akin to some of the Hobbit stuff we talked about too, and I think that's on purpose, right? Like it'd be stupid to
Hmm.
assume that that's not on purpose,
Hmm.
where you come back, the world is different, you've changed, it's changed. Like, can you reconcile yourself with both of those, like both sets of changes? Which is hard, right? Because you're processing both your own internal bullshit and also the world's external changes at the same time.
Hmm.
And I think for the most part, it seems like a good majority of our cast are going to be able to do it. Like, I think Dominic is in a really good spot at the end of this, actually, because I think he has processed a lot of the stuff that was all wrapped up together inside of him as Ash
Hmm.
in Die and sort of untangled it a little bit, which is good because they had talked about how all of his shameful impulses are also wrapped up with his like gender dysmorphia or fluidity or whatever you want to call it. I'm sure I
Hmm.
butchered that. Feel free to give me lessons. And it kind of started to like take that stuff apart and pick it apart. And I think also seems like even though we don't hear a lot about his partner in this story, which that's brought up I think in volume 1 or 2, where he's like, "You should be worried about this, right?" I'm kind of worried about it that we don't get a lot about his or her at that point partner.
Hmm.
But I feel like that relationship is gonna be fine once they talk everything out, given the pages we get in volume 4.
I think that's always a I mean, I'm probably being like overly generalizing here, but I think that sometimes that can be the hard part in any relationship, is realizing that your partner actually does know you. They perhaps know you the best of anyone in the world, and sometimes they'll know things about you that you don't necessarily know yourself, or at least realize. And so, that can be quite a good realization, and that might, as you said, like that relationship does seem, when when they make eye contact, and he said, "There's so much I need to tell you about," and she just says yes, and obviously she has news for him, but she knows that he might finally have come to a space where he can talk.
Yeah, if not about the issues that he's been exploring in Die specifically, like at least about Die itself, because that's a thing that they couldn't talk about before, right? Because they'd been bound by Ash in Die to not be able to talk about it in the outside world. So at the very
Mhm.
least, they're going to start getting into that, which then leads to the other stuff, I think is what his partner is hoping for. I don't know. That's one where it's like you get as much as you need, I feel like, but at the same time, I'd love to get more pages of that.
As you said, that's a high compliment when you want more of a story.
Yeah.
I'm flipping
Yeah.
through the pages of this again. Sorry, at the
No, go
end,
for it.
the very last image of the comic, which isn't actually Solomon looking at us with his very special eye. It's a pregnant woman sitting in front of a window. Is
Mhm.
that Izzy?
That's actually a very good question because,
Because Ash's partner doesn't have dark hair.
yep, I think that is actually a great question to ask.
But then these
And
like interstitial things are also sort of like while they were gone shots. So maybe it is supposed to be Ash's partner. But then she doesn't look pregnant when she's greeting him at the door. So I don't know who
I
that
mean, she's
is.
already had the baby at that point.
Oh, is there a baby in
no,
the
actually,
crib?
Maybe.
reconsidering, it does look like the hair is light and dark, whereas I think Izzy is just dark haired. So if
Yeah.
we scroll back to Ash's partner, it does look like she's got highlights potentially, or darker hair, depending on the light.
Yeah, I think it probably is Ash's partner, actually, who we should probably figure out the name of.
I'm
But the
sure we're
book
told it
doesn't
at some
care the name,
stage.
so it doesn't matter.
I guess I didn't
Sophie, there
realize
we go.
that. I didn't realize the kid had been born in that shot. I thought it was just like she is
I
pregnant
didn't.
and she set up a nursery.
Yeah, I did. I thought that was. I took it as that as well. I hadn't thought that the child was born yet.
Oh, I
So there
thought
was actually like a kid. Why wouldn't they just show her picking up the kid for Dominic? Right?
because
Like why
some
are they just?
yeah,
Why is it a shadowed crib as
maybe
opposed
Stephanie
to
House just didn't want to draw a baby.
Also,
fair?
it's
Reasonable.
Sophie. Sophie is his partner.
Yes,
Oh,
yeah.
okay, there we go.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think Matt. I think you're right. I think she has had the baby at that point. Yeah, it is just a shadowed crib.
What's in there? What's in the box?
But yeah, everyone kind of gets to come out of this reasonably okay. Like even Chuck, who was like going to die, like died and then came back to life, which is kind of nice.
And not only that, but he feeds. And correct me if I'm wrong, but he definitely feeds his tumor to Case, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Oh no,
Okay,
not his
cool.
tumor, the gold inside him. Sorry, like because all the fallen had the
Of
J gold in
course.
him. He's like,
Oh,
oh,
that
I'll
makes
just
so
kill
much more
myself.
sense. Yeah.
And we find out that
Yeah.
Matt's dad did not actually die, which I was not expecting that at all. Like that one actually got me, and I was like, oh, that's so nice.
Yeah, and look, I thought that was a really that did. I was happy by that, but I also did kind of question it because that almost
That
undercuts.
felt like it might have been a cheat of like, hey,
Yeah.
I just want to not quite have this be as sad as it was gonna be, because like turns out it's been a rough couple years for everyone. So I'm just gonna
Yeah.
I'm gonna cheat on this one, and that's fine. And you know what? For me, it's fine. It's been a rough couple years for everyone.
Yeah, it was something for them to come back in the middle of quarantine and have to wear masks or like figure out how to get masks for each other at the gas station.
Yeah, that was like, okay, we are committing to the 2020 bit, and I'm here for that. I mean, it really does add to that layer, right? Of like, you're gone and you change, and while you're gone, the world changes, right? Like, turns out the world did change this time.
The world moves on, which I mean leads to your point. Can you go home again?
I hope so, Jono. That's what I'm hoping for. I guess that's kind of
Please.
like, I've been kicking it around a lot because I'm wondering at this point in my life, this is where the podcast does turn into my therapy session for a little bit, guys. Sorry.
Let's do it.
Like, I've been kicking it around a little bit. I'm like, okay, are we just like, I'm very wary of nostalgia at this point. I'm like, oh God, are we just going back? Because like, we want to try to recapture something of the past that may or may not even exist at this point? Or like, is it legitimately a good idea to like go back to Madison essentially, where like we have friends, Pat's there, other friends of ours are there. My family's much closer. In Minnesota, because it's been a pandemic for 2 years, we haven't really had a chance to like make friends and stuff. And like we both work remote, so we don't even have like coworker friends really. Blah blah blah. My stress is unloaded now. And it's like, will things have just changed to the bit where it's not the same and it's not as good? Like, will it work? I don't know. I think we're still gonna do it and it's gonna happen, but I don't
I
know.
mean,
This story kind of threw that in my face a little bit.
I'm pretty
Yeah.
sure both in this story and like say Lord of the Rings, home is just what you make of it, Matt. I think you can make a home wherever you want it to be. And I think over stressing about comparing it to what it used to be to what it is now isn't going to do you any favors.
No, that's entirely true.
Think that's
Certainly true.
absolutely right. I think, look, as somebody who's moved home a few times, every time I've gone back uh, home, in inverted commas, whether it was going back to Harare after being away for years, even the first year I moved away from home in 2004, I did go back to Zimbabwe the following year, and it was just crazy how different the place was because, as you said, like you have this crystallized version in your head and you forget that everybody lives their lives. Everybody, like the world continues turning, and so when you go back, if you go back with that crystallized image, it's never going to match up. And even going back to like because I worked at Murdoch for a while, and even walking back through the village where we'd all stayed, there was that real pain of nostalgia, that real longing for the way things were, and just seeing how different the village was at that point. But I think Pat is exactly right. I think home really is a state of mind, and I think what we forget is the bad stuff. We forget all the hassles. We forget all the time, and all that's really crystallized is the good memories, which is perhaps a nice thing about that feeling. But if you go in with the idea of this is a place that we have lived before and we made it work and we can make it work again, I think that's a very healthy attitude to carry into it. And I think it sounds like you've got friends and stuff there, and that's already a big help, but it's just about how you'll make your lives work with theirs.
Yeah, no, and that's mostly how I'm thinking about it too. It's just like, especially because I've been so excited to read this book for like 4 months to have it just like pop up at this exact moment where we put an offer in on a house today. We won't get the house because we didn't bid over, and like you have to bid like $20,000 over to have a chance at a house in this crazy
Ugh.
COVID real estate market. But like to have this book pop up with these like questions and points at this specific moment in time feels like an arrow pointed at my heart a little bit. So thank you, Kieron Gillen, Stephanie Hodds and Co. You did it. You got me. But that was actually one of the things I was going to ask you guys too is like, do you have experiences with that where you've gone home and it hasn't been the same and it's either been disappointing or it's been like actually better, right? Like you go and you're like, "Oh, this has actually changed in a way that I didn't expect and it's better." Because I've had both in my life. So, I was like very I'm glad you shared those experiences, Jono.
I would say definitely times where I've gone back and it's been much worse. Uh, Zimbabwe is probably the best example where friends that I'd had there, they'd either all moved on or moved away, sorry, or they just weren't that interested in catching up, and that's kind of like realizing that you no longer have a place in that person's life is a hard thing to deal with. But at the same time, I mean, I went to back to the UK in 2017 for my cousin's wedding, and getting to show Engela like, oh, this is where I worked when I was 16. This is the supermarket that I worked at. This is the road that I used to walk back at 10 o'clock at night. This is the hour-long walk I would take at 10 o'clock to 11 o'clock at night to get home. This is where I did live. This is my grandparents' house. That was actually really great. Getting to share that with somebody else almost lessened the burden because you're like, that this is who I was, but who I am is now this person in this moment with you right now.
Yeah, and that's really beautiful, right? Like I think one of the best moments that I would say Kat probably also has had with that was actually your wedding, where we stayed at an Airbnb with our mutual friend Andy and his girlfriend, now fiance, I think, Caro. Yeah, now fiance Caro, and like that was really great. We kind of just fell into that, and like everything was sort of the way it was when we were in university in Australia, and like we came to the wedding, and like seeing you guys was just like really great, and like nothing awkward or like unsmooth about that. It's just like we kind of fell into it, and like everything was kind of the way it was without like any sort of having to build into it or work at it, and that was just like it was really nice, and it was something that I was kind of not trepidatious about going in, but like wondering like, oh, okay, is this gonna work? And it did. It just worked. Everything kind of clicked, and that was very
I mean,
rewarding.
I was terrified because for exactly those reasons. Like I was so like overwhelmed at the people that made the decision to travel that distance. And I think what was really special is the night before the wedding we had that dinner where basically I hadn't expected so many people to show up, but basically we took over the entire restaurant, and it
Yeah,
was
no, that was
people like
lovely.
yourselves, like friends that I that I'd made in Australia years before and hadn't really seen you guys since then, but mostly because I was banned from traveling. Um, and but also family who you guys hadn't met, but getting that mix. And I think my family friend Wendy Bourne, who she would just travel between table to table, making everybody feel comfortable. That was really special, and that was kind of the current, the past, and the future kind of colliding all at once, which was really special.
Yeah, no, that was like as a person who was on the other end of that, that was a really great evening, and I think and it like speaks to the power of you as a person also. But we could save some of our existential nonsense for the last question, I think, at this point.
I think so. Pat, do you have any sort of insight in terms of going home and it was good or not?
Well, I mean, I think I'm dealing with whatever, I mean, everyone will eventually deal with or is currently dealing with. Older parents getting older and going back and seeing them is always a shock to the system. So,
Right? It is. And like I talked to you about this, Pat, like one of the reasons we're moving back isn't just that Minnesota isn't working out. It's like I'm legitimately like at the point where it's like, okay, someone probably has to be close to my parents, and my brother like has a kid and he's busy, and like maybe it should be us. Because I think they've both, like, my mom had surgery on her back last year, and my dad is probably going to have surgery on his back this year. Both of them
sure.
because they're like in enough pain that they can't walk, and that's terrifying to me. Like,
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
so
It's a weird transitional state of going from we're born and our parents look after us, we grow up and there's a separation, and then we transition back into the role, but this time as the caretaker. And I think that's an incredibly hard space to be in as an adult, and it's an incredibly hard thing for your parents as well. Like I think it can be very difficult for parents to accept sometimes that they need somebody to care for them.
Yeah, for sure. And 2020 just never stops, does it? So it doesn't make it
still
any easier.
going, baby.
Yeah.
It will never
Well,
end now that
but I
die is
think
complete.
Yeah, why? Oh god.
But I mean, look, speaking as an outsider, obviously looking at the United States, you guys have gone through a particularly tough 2 years. I mean, it was just over a year ago that like your the seat of power in America was essentially under siege. But I think what is heartening, and I do take this quite seriously, is it's very heartening in America to see there's so many good people doing the right thing at the same time. And I think certainly from the outside we tend to only get the bad news because that's what sells. But you do hear the good news stories. You do hear about people participating in democracy by voting. You hear about people participating in democracy by having peaceful protests. And even I think that goes a long way towards repairing um, sometimes those issues is people participating and people and I do think to speak to your point, I think one of those is caring for the elderly. I think that's a duty of people, and that's so often, and not to judge people that put people in homes and stuff like that, but sometimes that's done more as a convenience rather than as like, well, this is the only way that my parents will get the care that they need. And so to hear you guys talk about it in the realm of, you're not doing it, you're not talking about it like it's an obligation. You're talking about it. It's like, oh no, we're going to do this because it's the right thing to do. And I think that is that's quite heartening. Even in the depths of 2020, there's still people that will do the right thing.
Yeah, for sure.
The Sam Gamgees.
Yes.
All right, so should we move on to the final boss of this podcast episode?
So a bit of context to this question before I ask it, because I drove up to Perth on the weekend to see a friend before he moved to the United States, and it's a bit of a journey these days to go up to Perth. It's a 5-hour drive from where we live. And the road is sometimes a little bit dangerous because you've got road trains and people just generally driving really badly. And obviously, adding into the mix COVID, because we finally have it in WA. So I was staying at a pretty rundown hotel. It was nice enough, but it was a bit rundown. And I was reading Die in between, kind of going for walks in Perth, and we talked about nostalgia. This was one of those moments of kind of walking past quality comics where Matt and Cal used to take me all the
It's
time.
literally
and,
the first place I thought about when you were talking about walking through downtown Perth.
That was one of the few places that I had to. I didn't actually end up going inside just because I didn't want to buy any more comics. I wanted to focus entirely on Die. But the last time I was in Perth, to give you some context, was January 2020, and that was when I purchased Volume 2 of Die at Quality Comics. So it's been a bit of a while since I've walked through the CBD. You guys posed the challenge of coming up with a discussion question, and that was that was probably the hardest part of coming up with something for the podcast. And I thought, like, knowing who I am and knowing all the bits and pieces of what makes me, the parts of myself that I'm open about, the parts of myself that I perhaps challenge me. Do you think you have found yourself? And that's a big identity is a big part of Die, as we've discussed. But do you think that you have found yourself? Do you think that you have had to challenge? Do you think that parts of you have challenged you to kind of think about yourself in different ways? And do you think how have you approached that? I guess.
Matt, you might go first.
Sure, we can continue my therapy session if that's what you guys want to do. I was going to let one of you go first because I feel like I monopolized a little bit, but
No, go ahead.
I would love to hear from either of you.
2 years ago, I would have said yes, and now I'm going to say no, is where I'm at, honestly. Like, I feel very adrift in a way that I don't think I've felt since I was like a teenager, honestly. And I think part of it's just like we moved across the country again. We went from Wisconsin to California, California to Minnesota. And like in that move from California to Minnesota, the thing that's different this time is like now it's a pandemic and it's been a pandemic the entire time.
Mhm.
And it's been really weird. So like we don't have a lot of ties in this community. And then we bought a house, which was stressful. And we bought a house that ended up being next to neighbors that are not great. And like I don't know that I like people anymore. And that's really weird as a person who's been pretty much an optimist for most of their life to feel like I don't know about people. Like you watch Doctor Who now and you're like, I don't know that you should believe in people, Mr. Doctor. Like you're putting a lot of faith in people that don't really deserve it, huh? Like, is that gonna work out? And it does usually in that show. And you're like, oh, I don't know how realistic that writing is. And you care that the writing is realistic in Doctor Who. Like that's where I'm at this point. Is like I feel like I'm in a weird adrift spiral. So I think for me to answer yes to do you think you found yourself would be a lie at this point. So I don't know. It's weird. But
It sounds like
I
you're
think it's still
you're
mostly
moving
there.
towards it. Yeah.
I think it's 80% there, but it's just been chipped away at by like stuff that I hadn't fully considered up to this point. I don't know. It's weird. I think I'm gonna make it out if that's if, like I think I will figure something out. I think I've got it, but I think it's still taking a little bit. And that's my answer. I could go deeper if you guys want, but I think I also will spare the listeners more of my babbling.
For what it's worth, I don't think you babbled at all.
Well, I mean, not on on this one too, but not, the second one I did a bit, so I can let you guys talk a little bit on this one.
I think my answer to this is similar to the answer to the finding you're going home again. I think the definition of yourself, who you consider yourself to be, changes.
It didn't flux a little bit, right? Yeah, I think that's fair.
Mhm.
I think I basically know who the core of the person that I am. But yeah, I think as you go through things, as we go through the trials that we talked about before, will change you. So, and yeah, like Matt is saying, past few years,
Last couple years have been rough for it, right? You're like, I think I know what's going on with this guy, Matt Ledger, but you don't really though, because turns out you don't know exactly what he's gonna do when it's pandemic times.
faith in my fellow man has diminished. I
Mhm.
would like to still think that the majority people will do what's right, but the evidence has mounted a little bit. The scales are starting to teeter, unfortunately, and I think at the end of the day, everything people want to do what is right. So I think Doctor Who is okay.
Right?
I think at the core of it, I think Doctor Who is right.
But whether you're an optimist or not is basically like, do you watch an episode of Doctor Who where he's like, I trust humans, and you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense, or do you not?
But so help me if 2024 comes around and it's something like a big orange thing comes up again, I'd be very upset. So we'll see how it goes.
But I think it's part of the reason I take the like our neighbors being shitty so personally is that I like tie it in with some of that like larger country at large shittiness, and it just like it's all wrapped up together, and I can't untangle it. I
Things
can't pull
just
it
seem to
apart.
swirl a little bit.
Yep. Yeah, it's
Mhm.
just it's all kind of packed together into this like hammer or like chisel, I guess. I don't know. Anyways,
What about you, Jana? How are you feeling?
Oh, look, I think those were both like really excellent answers, and I think that perhaps is, I mean, who I was in 2004 when I packed my room up and I packed a suitcase. I got on a plane with my parents and moved to the UK. Is not the same person as who I was when I moved back from the UK to Zimbabwe in 2007. And definitely not even the same person when I packed a suitcase again and moved to Australia in 2008. And I think a lot of that has been uh, the people that I've met and the people that have taught me lessons. I mean, obviously, there's been school and things like that, but I think a large part of that has been meeting people and being and starting to understand that it's okay to like certain things. I think meeting yourself, Matt, and Callum, and Cato, and Kat, and Brittany, and Sherry, and Josh. That was a big part of kind of finding out that it was okay to read comics and that it was okay to like board games. Things that would not really have been allowed or smiled upon at school when I was in Zimbabwe, with things that were actually quite common outside of that. And so, finding that part of myself, being allowed to be that person, was quite freeing in many ways. And I think you guys have talked quite a bit about kind of having your certainties chipped away at, and I think that perhaps to me has been the biggest lesson, is that anything that I'm 100% certain about myself will almost certainly be chipped away at. And much in the same way of Ash finding that the right word for them wasn't, there isn't a binary word for them, but there's much more fluid. I think that that's who I've come to understand myself as being. Is I've got a core person that I think I know. I think that I would never take an action that would hurt somebody else, unless that action might be to protect another person or to protect myself. But I think that and I certainly have a set of ethics and things like that that I try to live my life by. But a lot of the certainties in my life, a lot of the Jonos, the previous identities of mine have either turned out to be flawed in some way, or they weren't the complete picture. So they've just been one tiny piece of who I actually am, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And that sounds very grandiose. I don't mean to be like that I'm this awesome person. It's just more that I think all the things that I thought I knew about myself perhaps were challenged in a positive way. I mean, I think perhaps the worst was, and this comic was a very interesting look at it, but the worst was obviously growing up, uh, in Zimbabwe, homosexuality was illegal. And so knowing that and what we were taught at school, my attitudes towards that were very rooted in what I was taught. And finding out years later that some of the kids that I was at school at, they have since come out. They're living in different countries, of course, but just understanding what they must have gone through and some of the thoughtless things that we as kids would say, and that would be endorsed by the adults that were teaching us. I think that has given me real pause for thought about that, because you see what I mean. Ash's example in the comic is obviously a fictional one, but there are people that really struggle with that kind of thing, and thinking back to my own upbringing, that's a very difficult thing to think that I was part of that problem, that I was part of what might have been. I'd like to say that I never bullied anybody, but I don't know that that's true. I'd like to say that I never said a thoughtless comment, but I know that's not true. And so, grappling with that as an adult, I think at a certain point you have to forgive your younger self for not knowing better, but you can still feel a sense of unease. Like, I don't think I'll ever fully. I think I can absolve myself, my past self, but I'll always carry that knowledge of that. I can forgive, but I can't forget. And I think that that's also been a part of it. Is my identity has been learning to try and just be better, just to try and be, to not repeat the mistakes of the past.
Yeah, which I think is, to bring it back to the comic for a second, like so much of what this comic is about is just people that are like, by being thrust into this game, like being challenged to figure out not only who they are but who they should or could be.
Hmm.
So, I mean, it's just a weird fantasy version of what real life does to the rest of us, anyways. And sometimes it's easier in the fantasy version to figure it out, right? Like, because you're actually confronted with just straight up, literally, the Balrog representation of your gender issues, like that sort of thing. And not even just your gender issues, right? Like, the side of you that wants to do things that you may or may not feel like you're comfortable with. So,
Definitely. And I think that we joked that this was your therapy episode, but I think there's actually a core of truth to that, because I think a lot of role playing games actually give people the space where it's safe to explore that sort of stuff, because the much in the same way as Die, there is clear boundaries between the fantasy world and the real world. And so, you can behave and act in a certain way safely there to explore that and to unpick it. And then you can put the game down and, take the lessons, but not the consequences.
yeah, and I think if the Die Creative team listened to this episode and like listened to me describe it as my therapy episode, they'd all smile and be like, "Yes, we did it." So I don't feel bad about that for that reason of like, I think for Die to have done some of that work, I think the people behind it would be very happy about that, and hopefully some of the people who read it will also connect with that, because I think it's a lot of what this book really turns on and is about. So, whew, we did it, guys. That was a marathon.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm terrible for you guys. Like, whenever you guys bring me on, I tend to like waffle, and then, we go to some weird places.
No, I mean
Places we
this
want to go, Jono. It's
this
fine.
specific book we were always going to talk for at least 2 hours about. Like, there was no possible way we were going to not even quote unquote focused questions be to ask. Like, that just wasn't going to happen. Like, this was always going to be a marathon, not a sprint.
Just quickly before we close
Yeah.
it up. So, I think part of my issue with this final volume and describing both RPGs like this and I guess this discussion as a therapy. I guess I've never considered tabletop role-playing games as that. I always more considered as just escapist fantasy.
No, and I think that's definitely a valid read and or like use of the like there's a power fantasy aspect of it too, right? Which is I think very much in line with what they are in a lot of different. I mean, the game is always just what you make of it, right? Like, what am I for? Like, is the question.
Exactly. I think so. Yeah. I think there's no wrong answers in terms of what enjoyment you derive from tabletop RPG is your, as long as you're not harming the other player's enjoyment. I think then that's entirely yeah.
Well, I'm just wondering if using that as a reflection of how my opinion is of this, the finale of this. Maybe it's because I'm viewing it from I a, an escapist fantasy angle as opposed to like majority of these characters. It's all therapy for them, right?
Yeah,
They're
I
all
mean,
getting some like life
part of your guys' thing
affirming.
was like there's no grand battle at the end, right? And like I never expected a grand battle. I always expected it to be people talking at each other because
Well,
that's what Die is. Die isn't so much about the metal dragons, it's about
yeah,
the
no, I
people.
wasn't.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't. I mean, I wasn't expecting if it ended up with like a MCU CG fest at the end of this. I would not have been
Beam
happy
of light.
either.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah.
Anyways,
So finding like a safe place and definitely players and especially a dungeon master to feel safe with, I think would be very cool. I don't know if that is a game that I would want to participate in or
yeah,
feel
and like
comfortable
I'm
in.
as a person again who has DM'd, I don't know that I would trust myself to be that dungeon master. Like I don't think I would want to come near that. If that makes
I think
sense.
that would be that would be a very difficult position of responsibility to assume. But I think, Pat, interestingly enough, I think we did kind of touch on this, but we weren't maybe looking at it from this way. But you asked the question, do you think this volume's meta commentary helped or hurt the story? And I
Yeah,
think that what we've just described is exactly that, is that, there's some very serious stuff happening. And we talked about how there was this need sometimes to undercut it with a quip or with like a one liner. And I think that's exactly what we wouldn't want in a game like this. If we're playing with our souls bared and we're having this experience where we're, really plumbing the depths of ourselves, the last thing we want is somebody making a one liner about it. And I think that you would feel so reduced by that. And it really it would damage your trust in the story, so to speak.
yeah, absolutely.
Guys, do we want to do recommendations, or do we feel like we've given the people enough content?
I have no idea what to recommend after this.
We have recommendations in our first episode. Do we want to just be like, do those? Do those recommendations, you guys?
Looking
I
at
think
mine,
I've got
I said Rat Queens, which I don't feel like is a proper recommendation anymore after this.
After Volume 4, yeah, that's
Yeah,
fair.
I mean, I had the thought of, I don't know if you guys have read Unwritten, which kind of touches on this. It's a series about this shadowy cabal of people that have been using authors to influence the course of history and stuff like that. In a sort of similar to Die, but I don't know if I could recommend it in the same vein. Like if you liked Die, I can't guarantee that you'll like Unwritten because Die does seem quite singular in its appeal.
Weekend in the Divine's good. It's about twice as long, so I mean,
I mean,
there
yeah,
you
I've
go.
enjoyed what I've read of it. I still need to finish it. I need to do that.
Yeah, we'll get to that one, Pat. It's another one we could do the first volume of and the last volume of. It's on the list.
Okay. And that's another Kieron Gillen one? Is that right?
Yeah,
It
with
is.
Jamie McKelvey on art. I think Clayton Cowles on lettering still also, which also does a bang up job in that one. If
There are many
I'm
more
mistaken.
volumes of that.
Yeah, that's like a 40 issue series. That one I have the single issues of for the most part. So
I have all the trades. I just haven't finished reading it yet.
Isn't the conceit though, Matt, that you have to read the trade?
oh, Jono.
Thank you, Jono.
The
I mean, if you don't have
mechanics
the
of the
single,
mechanics of the RPG that are the podcast are not that fixed, fortunately. All right,
I guess
guys.
yes, I will recommend one thing.
Sure.
Okay.
Uh, Joe Pera talks with you.
Oh,
because I
actually,
feel like
that is a pretty baller recommendation from this. Yeah,
because I
all
feel like
right.
that is an example of a format that is both unique in the way that it's run, but it is also a form of therapy. And it is also there are moments of genuine tragedy in it, and there are just moments where you are laughing yourself silly, and it manages to kind of, I don't know, it manages to be almost like an episode of therapy each 10-minute chunk.
Yeah, it is a thing that definitely like whether you're sitting with it because you're like very happy with it, or you're sitting with it because it made you think, or you're sitting with it because it made you sad, like you're sitting with it in the same way
It,
that you're sitting with this book. That's a good
well said.
recommendation.
I think if I had to recommend anything, as I was saying, I'm a big fan of escapist fantasy, and I've been really diving into a genre of anime called isekai, which basically just means other world, where it's this. It's normal people being brought into fantasy worlds, and it's usually just a power trip. They're usually overpowered in some way, and like it's just really fun to see them
So it's the
interact with their
opposite of
fantasy
this.
world.
It's the opposite of this.
Right. It's
While
not
also being this.
the majority of them are not as bleak and not as, I guess, emotionally deep as this is.
I think that's a really good recommendation. Yeah, I'd love to. Are you reading them or are you watching them?
I mostly watch them. If you're into video games, I would say Log Horizon's a good one to watch. And of course, probably the best example I could come up with is Spirited Away, the Miyazaki
Classic, yeah.
film.
All right, guys. I think that is going to do it for this month's discussion of Die at 2 hours and change. As always, if you want to get in touch with Pat or myself, you can find us on Twitter as @WattPodcast. You can also email us at waitingonthetrade@gmail.com and read more comics-related goodness at mattreadscomics.com. Jono, do you want people to find you online? If so, let them know where.
I think after the amount that I shared in this episode, I don't want the authorities tracking me down. But yes, I do have Instagram at Jonathan Gurney. It is a private account, so you'll have to ask for permission to follow me. But I pretty much only decline the numerous bots that attempt. So yeah, not that my
Very
Instagram is
nice.
particularly exciting. It is just photos of my pets and all beers that I'm drinking.
Again, I think we've had this discussion before, but like that sounds like Instagram to me. Well, guys, I really enjoyed this. I've been looking forward to it for like what 4 months at this point, and it did not disappoint. So thank you both for coming on and talking about the end of Die with me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Oh,
I may
likewise,
have
guys.
railroaded
Always
you into
such a
this,
pleasure.
but
It's such a pleasure to come on and chat with you guys. Not just because the comic was really interesting, but because I think you guys always, without fail, provide just such an interesting perspective. I don't know if you guys always agree on the comic, whether you like the comic that you've read or not. But I certainly think in the example of Die, I think both of you just bring so much to the conversation that it just makes it so interesting to talk about.
I'm gonna print that, put it on a billboard.
It's very kind of you, Jana. I think what it is you elevate our discussions, Jana. So we definitely need to have you back on again and again. So thank you.
You literally just need to tell me what book you want to read, and I'm down.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. We'll have to pick another one, or if you come up with something, Jono.
Oh yeah, because the Hardy Boys was such an interesting read.
We had a good discussion about it.
We did.
It was.
No, we did. Look, I'm always keen to discuss any books. I think what might be interesting next time, and I'm not putting this as a rule, but I would love for Pat to choose some variety of isekai anime for us to discuss. Manga, rather, because the manga is the comic book and anime is the animated, isn't it?
Yep.
Correct.
Yeah.
Pat hasn't had a choice in a while, actually. Pat's pretty due, so
hasn't been railroading the conversations.
Oh, Matt just likes the railroading so much. Oh.
Hey, you've got recorded evidence of it.
Yeah, he gives me the illusion of choice, and I just go with it.
Yeah, you make interesting choices, which are, will you show up for the podcast recording or not?